Hello, this is Lauren. I'm in Albany at the Pre-Advocacy Day conference, but that's okay because we still have a coffee break. And you're going to hear today from Stephanie Anderson from Darien Library in Connecticut. I'm just going to go ahead and hand it over to her, and here you go.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm waving at you from beautiful Darien, Connecticut. I hope you're all having as good weather as we are today. I'm going to spend 15 minutes of your time talking about great answers for tough RA questions. We're going to talk about 3 particular kinds of RA questions. So we'll just go ahead and get started because 15 minutes is not a lot of time. All right, so this here is the Platonic ideal of RA, right? What do we talk about when we talk about RA? This interaction here is what we're talking about. A patron comes in, he's fully aware of his desires as a reader, like not just in general, but he knows exactly what he wants right now, is precise, well-mannered, and when we take all this information and run it through our little internal systems and come up with exactly the right book, and everyone is stunned. The right book, the right reader, the right time, all the good RA stuff, that is the Platonic ideal. Unfortunately, this is an illusion in pretty much every sense of the word. Real-life RA is often messy and rushed, and sometimes, as you can see in this picture with some passive RA, mistakes get made. Most people don't know what they like to read, or why they like it, or what they want at the moment, or even if they're in the mood to be reading, and even if they do know those things, they might have trouble talking to us in the same language we're used to. Which is great for readers' advisors in the sense that we have job security, but it does mean that tough RA questions are just part of doing readers' advisory on a regular basis. And this is true no matter what our job titles or training or what library we work in. I'm going to use the phrase readers' advisors a lot through this presentation just as a catch-all for anyone who does readers' advisory, whether you're a reference librarian or an administrator or a circulation clerk or whatever you do in your library. When I say readers' advisor, I mean you if you do readers' advisory. So before we get into the questions, I just want to set a little bit of context for some of the ideas I'm going to put forth today in terms of adult readers in particular. Where are This is from October of 2015. 72% of American adults read a book last year, which I think is great. It's actually a lot more than we go around talking about. The median books read is 4. And then people like you and I probably are pulling up the average to an average books of 12 books per person. And the reason I mention this is that if you compare that then to, these are the top 10 of the BookScan adult fiction sales. So, you know, 1.6 million copies of Go Set a Watchman sold last year, and this is just in retail bookstores. 1.4 million copies of Gray by E.L. James, 1.3 million of The Girl on the Train. So these are all the most popular books in America, and none of them sold more than 2 million copies, which is really not that many in the grand scheme of how many adult readers there are in the country. The reason I bring this up is that I want you to remember as we talk about these tough RA questions that the question you find tough to answer is possibly even tougher for the person who is asking it. Remember, many people asking tough or vague RA questions like we're going to talk about today are closer to the median of like 4 books a year because you and I are probably reading 20, 30, 40 books a year and bringing up the average. I mention this because the tendency for most people is to be flustered by any RA question, let alone a tough RA question. So this is what leads people to try to just rush through a transaction or just find like quote unquote a right answer and move on or even get defensive. So I ask you to remember as we go through these 3 questions that the questioner, the person asking you this tough question, is probably feeling even more anxiety than you are. It never feels like it when you get a tough RA question, but you are the empowered person in these conversations. Let's remember that and be generous as we think about these questions. So Sahali Begum has done some really interesting research into leisure reading, which is what we're going to talk about today, and including proving that so-called escapist fiction has value for mental health reasons. But it is her promotion of reading as a transformative act that I'm asking you to think about here as well. Our goal in answering tough RA questions does not necessarily need to be every single time a transformative experience. That would be extremely exhausting for everybody. However, it is possible. So again, I ask you to think, when you're facing a recalcitrant patron or somebody's asking your 5th question, or you've handed over 10 titles and nobody wants any of them, allow yourself to dream big. There is transformative emotional power behind one of these covers in your books for your reader. It's worth the slog. Or if you're allergic to academia, Here are the simple things to remember. Right book, right reader, right time are our goals, and Ranganathan's second and third laws of library science are where we're going to begin. So, what's the last great book you read? This always strikes me as a stealth RA question, and it doesn't make it any easier. It's what people ask when they want you to recommend them a book, but they didn't actually want to ask you. This does not apply to patrons with whom you already have a close reading relationship, so leave them out of it. I find it comes from men more often than women, don't ask me why, but sometimes it's almost posed as a dare, like, what's the last great book you read? So how do we answer it, especially when it usually comes without warning? Well, the first thing I'd like you to remember is Catherine Sheldrick Ross's valuable advice and research, which shows that getting personal advice on reading matter is something readers both yearn for and dread. It's much safer to ask somebody else's taste than expose your own, but you, as a smart reader's advisor, know that except in rare cases, what you really enjoyed recently is unlikely to be the right book for this particular reader at this time or any other. So what are you to do? The first thing I'd recommend is answer a question with a question. The sooner you can turn a reader into talking about her last great book, the faster you are to RA bliss. Demur, you can say something like, oh, it's so hard to say. What's the last great book you read? No matter how they answer, you've at least bought yourself a little bit of time to breathe and think. Second, use this opportunity to demonstrate that there are many ways for a book to be great, which is something a lot of people believe but don't necessarily feel comfortable talking about with a librarian. Make it clear that great doesn't mean great expectations, and that can go a long way. So you can say something like, what do you mean by great? Great means one thing for me when I'm with a book group, and another thing when I'm on vacation, and not yet another thing when I'm commuting. You can clarify that they can ask for different sorts of books in this way without pandering to them. There's always a chance you'll get a person who wants to then mansplain great fiction to you, but, it's a dangerous job, Reader's Advisory. If these tactics don't work, be ready to provide a title. That's how you're going to get out of this question. You might get people who don't want to engage, which is frustrating. In that case, it might be tempting just to tell them to read A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara and terrify them into never asking you for advice again. Instead, don't give in to that. Have a half dozen titles at your mind's fingertips that you know work for pretty much all readers and are likely to be on the shelf in your library. Adjust which one you recommend according to how the conversation has gone so far. Like, for example, my sure bet list includes Angle of Repose by Wallace Stegner, A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki, Case Histories by Kate Atkinson, Salt by Mark Kurlansky. Some of those books are books that are personal favorites are mine, and frankly, some are just books I've enjoyed and noticed other people enjoyed. Some of them are books that my colleagues enjoyed more than I did. But I know the titles, I know my colleagues' titles. Sometimes people don't warm up until they have a book in hand that they can give you feedback on. And other people really, truly just wanted you to hand them a book you thought was great. So how about, do you know anything about ... It always happens. The extremely specific RA question about the subgenres you barely know the outlines of. Some common people who offend: space opera, locked room mysteries, novel set in Myanmar and only Myanmar, paranormal romance that only has werewolves and not a single vampire. We've all got islands of knowledge, and then we've all got very vast seas in which we're barely treading water. Personally, mine is audiobooks. I'm horrible with audiobook RA. Also space opera. So what do you do in this situation? The first thing is to listen to Douglas Adams and don't panic. You may not be the expert in this situation, but you are still empowered. And, as Duncan Smith wrote in the year 2000, it's not acceptable for a reference librarian to respond to a patron's request for information on starting a small business by saying, I started a small business once, here's how I did it. So, if this behavior is not acceptable for reference questions, why is it acceptable for a librarian to respond to a request for a good book with, I read a book that you might like to read? Likewise, it would be unacceptable for a librarian to answer that question by saying, I'm sorry, I've never started a small business before, so I can't help you. We work in a library. It's not our job to know everything. It's our job to find the answers to everything. And this is also true for RA. So when you face a question that's tough because it's overly specific, let go of the idea that you need to know the answer quickly and right off the top of your head. Remember, think back to our goals. Our goals are right book, right reader, right time. Nobody said anything about doing it in 2 minutes or less. We are not a Pizza Hut. Nobody gets any extra credit points for doing it quickly. So what do you do? Well, Novelist can be a great resource. If you are lucky enough to work for a library that subscribes to Novelist, make sure that you're familiar with the basic search functions so that you can use it in these situations. But if not, we're lucky enough to live in the age of many excellent free websites with quality information on specific genres and subgenres. Smart Bitches Trashy Books is a one-stop guide to romance, and Dear Author can fill in anything they miss. Stop, You're Killing Me is it for mystery guidance, especially if you're trying to figure out the relationships between series and different authors. And this is quite beyond Goodreads and library things, all of which have excellent crowdsourced lists of books. So they can all be a real guide to you, and you can walk through them with a patron. Now, Stephanie, you'll say, my patron could do that himself. It's the 21st century. But first, I would ask you not to assume that. For many patrons, even those who are avid readers, the many resources of the bookdernet, as they say, are unknown or totally overwhelming. I assume most of the people listening right now, you work in a public library, so you're pretty aware already of the tech phobia and anxiety that lies beneath the surface with a lot of public library patrons. So in addition to doing good RA by helping them find a list of books they might like, you might also be connecting them with a community or resource online they are simply not going to find on their own. Okay, you might say, but my patron has super niche interests. We might be able to find them a list, but I don't know if we have any of the books actually in our library. Awesome. That's fine. This can be a long-term project. For this interaction, rather than making your goal be like write book, write reader, write time, write immediately, refocus your goal. Try to find one book today, but then start building for the future. If you can, print out a list that you find. Send your patron home with it. Show her right at the desk how she can place a purchase request or how she can place an ILL. If you're allowed to, place an ILL for her. Start getting her set up for success and getting these books that you don't have in your library. And if it's possible, follow up with your collection development people and say, hey, here's why these requests are coming in. It might be something to consider for the future. Now, of course, you might be sitting on your hands the whole time thinking, oh, well, I was just the wrong person to answer this question. And that's even better. My colleague would have been perfect to answer this question, but he was at lunch. Awesome. Follow steps 1 and 2. Share some resources, look for a list, see what you can do in terms of thinking long term, but also let the patron know you've got someone who's going to follow up with them. Because how cool is it to not only get a nice person trying very hard to help you in the moment, but also get a personalized follow-up note, somebody who knows even more about the thing that you care about. You might also think about where appropriate if there are other book groups in the community or other resources you could put your patron in touch with where they could talk to another expert, put them in touch with another expert. When faced with someone who knows more about a subject than we do, we tend to defer and assume they already know everything. Don't assume. The final question we'll talk about is, I'll take anything. No, not that. Oh, no, not that. Oh, gosh, why would you think I would read that? This can be the hardest RA question of all, because you've already made it to the point of engagement with the patron. You're handing them something. The patron is interacting with you and providing some feedback, just happens to be negative feedback that it's really hard to act on. Worse, this sort of interaction often happens when patrons are in a big rush, like a parent who's on their way to school pickup or someone who's on their lunch break and only has 10 minutes. Meanwhile, you're handing out life-changing books. All the books on the screen right now are books in a recent Reddit thread about books that changed my life. So these might be really good books to have in your back pocket, by the way. And you're book talking your heart out and you're just getting bupkis. Why did they even ask my opinion, you're wondering? What are you supposed to do in this situation? So I think the first thing for you to remember is that it's really possible that the person you're talking to, as you're handing them To Kill a Mockingbird and The Hobbit and Little House on the Prairie and The Little Prince and all these different things, is they might actually be truly unable to articulate why a book is working for them or not working for them. This is not a judgment. I am able to articulate many important things myself. Articulating about books is basically the only thing I'm capable of. So pushing on somebody by using library jargon or book jargon isn't going to clarify something. Like, this is a bad time to say, it sounds like you don't like unreliable narrators, or it sounds like you don't want a woman as the main character of a novel. Even if that's true, it's unlikely to help in this situation. If you figure that out yourself, great, because it might make the rest of the interaction a little easier, but you don't need to engage with the patron in that way. Respect how they're working or not with you. Those of you who have received training in RA in the past, or who have based RA on your training with a reference interview, your instinct is always going to be to kindly ask more questions, to dig deeper, to get more information. Understand that this is a situation that might not be improved by that tactic. You might have to go a different route. Instead, while making a few connections in your head about what the books you're handing over have or don't have in common, maybe change the subject a little. Ask some questions that are vaguely related to the task at hand, but are way easier for anybody to answer, and also give you a little feedback about the person you're working with. My two favorites are, where do you read? And what have you been watching on TV? A great thing about these questions is that, unless someone is truly just being obstreperous, most people can answer them without thinking, and they do give you insights into your patron. For example, if someone says, the only time I get to read is on the subway, you might realize that these long, beautiful novels you're handing them, like A Little Life or complicated stories, aren't what they're looking for, even if they can't or won't tell you that. Or they might even be worried about you judging them for saying that. Or if they say, I don't get to read often, but I'm about to go on vacation, that's also valuable. So maybe you're reaching for George Saunders now or some romance novellas. TV is a nice equalizer too, because although a lot of adults aren't confident in their opinions about books, especially when talking to somebody who they think is smarter than them, no one has a problem talking about TV, and everyone has an opinion about TV. And I probably don't need to explain how I love Game of Thrones or I'll watch anything Shonda Rhimes works on can help you move in a more helpful direction with your patron. Finally, I'll again remind you that although you should be aiming to get a book in hand immediately, especially the right book for the right reader at the right time, this is another great opportunity to use follow-up to provide the best possible reader's advisory. Don't just think of the next 5 minutes as the reader's advisory interaction. Think about how you can follow up on it. Especially if the patron seems to be in a hurry, ask them if you can give them a call later or send an email with more suggestions as you think of them. That'll give you a little bit of time to maybe consult with one of the resources we talked about, consult with a colleague, put something out on Twitter and see if people have feedback. And finally, remember that RA is just as valuable for the interaction as the books that you're handing over. Laurel Teruli found that studies provide evidence that the interaction between readers and staff is actually more valuable than the correct or appropriate answer. By managing this sort of tough RA question well, keeping conversation going, trying different pathways, or following up after the fact, you are providing just as valuable a service to somebody, even if it seems difficult, as you did for the previous patron, who of course loved everything you brought him and checked out 10 books and comes back every single day. Both of those are really valuable readers' advisory interactions. So that's 15 minutes on tough RA questions. There are obviously a lot of other tough RA questions, but you probably want to spend the rest of your coffee break or your lunch break not looking at a computer screen, so I'll finish there. You see my email on the bottom of the screen below. If you have a specific question or any feedback, feel free to email me at any time about it. And I wish you a beautiful day full of patron lottery winners. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. And thanks for hanging out and watching. If you're still watching, you can like, subscribe, comment, share, all of that stuff down underneath me and in the description. Thanks, Stephanie. And everybody go have lunch. All right, bye.